The supply closet at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like bleach and broken promises. Natalie Hayes had been folding linens for 3 hours, white sheets, blue blankets, surgical drapes, her hands moving with mechanical precision through the fluorescent-lit silence of the storage room in Denver. The work was beneath her. Everyone knew it. Nobody cared. She'd been a senior chief petty officer. 23 years of service. 3 tours in Tikrit sector. Hands that had pulled shrapnel from a 6-year-old Iraqi boy's chest while mortars screamed overhead. Hands that had held 17 lives together in dusty FOB corridors when the surgeons were miles away. Those same hands now folded hospital linens in a closet the size of a shipping container because the nursing director had glanced at her credentials, raised an eyebrow, and assigned her to get acclimated to our culture before moving to a real nursing position. Acclimation. Code for, "We don't trust you yet." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Natalie didn't mind the sound. Fluorescent hum was better than the screams. Better than the mortar fire that still woke her at 0300, heart hammering, sheet soaked through. Better than Tikrit. She was refolding a sheet, corner to corner, crease sharp as a blade, when Dr. Sterling's voice carried through the doorway. Not directed at her. Never directly. That wasn't his style. The voice had the smooth arrogance of a man who'd never been told no, who'd never had to think about consequences because there weren't any. $20 as the new girl quits within a week, Sterling announced to the cluster of residents trailing him through the hallway. His voice was the sound of a surgeon cutting through bone, precise, clinical, unmistakably sharp. They always do when they realize how we run things here. Natalie didn't look up. The sheet folded. Crease. Quarter turn. Crease again. The residents laughed. Not genuine laughter. The practiced kind that came from people lower on the hierarchy, maintaining position through compliance. She recognized the sound because she'd heard it in every military chain of command she'd ever served, the laughter of people afraid to disappoint authority. Sterling's footsteps passed the doorway. His cologne arrived first, expensive, the kind that cost more than Natalie's weekly groceries, then his white coat, pressed so sharp it could cut skin, then the absence where he'd been. The residents followed, their voices fading down the corridor. Natalie continued folding. Her left hand, the one that trembled when she tried to hold still, kept steady when the work demanded precision. 3 years ago, a civilian therapist had told her the tremor was residual trauma response. Natalie had nodded, paid the copri, and never gone back. She understood the tremor perfectly. It was the weight of everything she'd had to put down. The tremor was the memory of what her hands had done, trying to shake themselves free. The folded linen stacked higher. 20 years in the Navy. 23 years, actually, she'd re-enlisted twice. 3 deployments to Tikrit, where she'd served as a field trauma specialist attached to a SEAL team. The Navy Cross didn't make the stack go faster. The 2 Bronze Stars with Valor didn't make Sterling's voice any quieter. And the Silver Star sitting in a box at home, wrapped in tissue paper like something fragile, didn't change the fact that she was folding linens in a supply closet in Denver because she'd walked away from all of it 3 years ago and chosen invisibility instead. The screams had stopped her from sleeping through the night. The faces of the people she couldn't save had stopped her from sleeping through the day. The command structure, the orders, the mission focus, the brotherhood, all of it had started to feel like a cage made of loyalty, and she'd woken up one morning in a VA hospital in San Diego and realized she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't train younger SEALs. Couldn't deploy. Couldn't wake up at 0300 anymore hearing the mortars and knowing that if she closed her eyes for 2 seconds, someone would die. So she'd left. Hung up her dress uniform. Put the combat boots, her daughter's, actually, child-sized, still stained with Tikrit dust, in a box at the back of her closet. Changed her name on her CV to just N. Hayes, RN. Found a civilian job in a city where nobody knew her, where nobody asked about the screams, where she could be anonymous. Just another tired nurse in scrubs 2 sizes too large, invisible as the sheet she folded. Natalie pulled a new stack of white linens toward her. The fabric was cool under her fingers. Institutional quality, thin from 100 washings, the kind that fell apart if you pulled too hard. She'd learned not to pull too hard. The cardiac unit billing record sat on a small shelf in the corner of the closet, waiting to be filed. She'd noticed them 3 days ago, a loose stack of printouts that should have been locked in the office. Curious, she'd glanced through while waiting for a laundry delivery. Just habit. Operational awareness. The same instinct that had kept her alive in Tikrit, always notice what's wrong. The billing inconsistencies had jumped out immediately. Phantom procedures. Codes for interventional cardiology that didn't match the chart notes. Medicare claims for 23 cardiac catheterizations in a single week, but the cardiac lab log showed only 8 scheduled cases. The money was moving somewhere. Not enormous amounts per procedure, $3,400 here, $5,200 there, but multiplied across dozens of phantom codes, it added up to something significant. Something that required very specific knowledge of both Medicare billing and hospital protocols. The kind of knowledge Sterling would have. Natalie had filed the papers carefully back in their place, hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Hadn't even written them down. That was the civilian world rule she'd learned: keep your head down, do your job, don't ask questions that make powerful people uncomfortable. The Navy was about command structure and duty. The civilian world was about survival. Different rules. Quieter. Safer. She folded another sheet. The corner creases perfectly, a skill that required no thought anymore. Her hands had learned the geometry of it. Crease to crease. Quarter turn. Fold in half. Stack with the others. Through the open doorway, the cardiac unit corridor stretched out, beige walls, fluorescent lights casting everything in that institutional pallor, the quiet sound of monitor beeping from patient rooms, the distant ding of an elevator arriving. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something medicinal she'd never quite identified. Hospital smell. Sick people and cleaning supplies, and the particular exhaustion that came from saving lives that nobody acknowledged. Dr. Sterling's voice carried past again, farther down the hallway now. Told the attending that if he wants privileges renewed, he needs to start referring cases to me. The residents laughed again. Compliance laughter. Natalie didn't flinch. Didn't pause. Didn't look toward the doorway. Her jaw worked once, a single moment of tension, then released. The tremor in her left hand steadied itself the way it always did when she needed it to. Operational composure. The military had trained that into her so completely that 3 years of civilian life hadn't erased it. 23 years of service and only 3 years away, and the discipline was still there, still bone deep. She pulled another sheet from the hamper. White linen, still warm from the dryer. The heat radiated into her palms. She folded it with the same precision as the 100 before it, the same precision as the 1,000 before that. Muscle memory. Not the kind that came from repetition. The kind that came from survival, from knowing that if your hands faltered, people died. The billing discrepancies nagged at her. She'd noticed something else yesterday while filing, a notation in Sterling's office, partially visible on a desk, mentioning the referral percentage optimization. Medical terminology wrapped around financial language. The kind of phrasing that appeared in medical fraud cases she'd read about during her civilian nursing training. Kickback scheme terminology, though she'd never say it aloud. Not her problem. She'd left the Navy because problems were exhausting. Problems were why she woke up screaming. But the billing records kept accumulating on that shelf in the supply closet. And each day, the discrepancies grew. Natalie folded another sheet, then another, her hands moving like they were underwater, smooth, efficient, disconnected from the woman holding them. This was dissociation, her therapist would have called it. Natalie called it compartmentalization. The Navy had taught her that too: put the thing you can't deal with in a box, seal it, store it where the monsters can't reach it, and keep moving forward. She'd put Tikrit in a box. The 23 years in the Navy in a box. The screams, the faces, the 6-year-old boy's chest opening under her hands, the 17 lives that had depended on her staying calm while mortars detonated close enough to feel, not just here, all of it sealed away, filed in the back section of her mind where she didn't have to look at it. And now the billing discrepancies were trying to escape from their box too. Natalie pulled the last stack of sheets toward her and began folding. This was her job now. Invisibility. Competence without acknowledgement. A woman in scrubs 2 sizes too large, folding linens in a supply closet, asking no questions, making no waves, waiting out the shifts until she could go home to her son, make dinner, sleep without screaming, wake up and do it all again. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere in the cardiac unit, patients lay in beds, their hearts failing in ways both visible and hidden. Somewhere, Dr. Sterling calculated his referral percentages and phantom procedure codes. And in a supply closet that smelled like bleach and institutional failure, a senior chief petty officer who'd saved 17 lives folded sheets for $19.50 an hour. The sheet creased under her hands. Perfect corners. The geometry of invisibility. And then Sterling's voice came through the doorway one more time, not directed at her, never directed at her, but close enough that every word carried weight. The girl's probably sleeping during her break anyway. They all are, the ones who wash out of better careers. No spine. No staying power. The sheet folded. Crease sharp as a blade. Her hand stayed steady. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. 3 years of civilian practice had taught her one thing perfectly: how to disappear. How to let words pass through her like she wasn't even there. The laughter faded. The footsteps moved away. And Natalie continued folding, sheet after sheet, her hands remembering what her mind had tried to forget, waiting for something she couldn't name to change, knowing it never would because this was the life she'd chosen: quiet, anonymous, safe. But that wasn't the worst part. The cafeteria smelled like industrial bleach and overcooked chicken. Natalie carried her tray past the physician's table, keeping her eyes forward, when Dr. Sterling stood abruptly and knocked it from her hands. Food scattered across tile like a detonation. Charts fluttered through gravy. The room went silent. Nobody moved. His smile was a predator's smile. "Clumsy," he said loudly enough for the entire department to hear. "Maybe try both hands next time, sweetheart." He dropped a stack of patient files at her feet, papers spreading through the mess like shrapnel. "Pick that up." Natalie knelt slowly. Her scrubs hit the wet tile. She gathered charts with movements that were precise, controlled, every motion calculated. One tear escaped, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of restraint, from the effort of keeping something ancient and dangerous locked inside her chest. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her voice quiet as frozen steel. "I've picked up better men than you off desert floors, Doctor." The cafeteria held its breath. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A surgical resident froze with a fork halfway to his mouth. Sterling's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes, the brief flicker of a man recognizing that he'd misjudged his opponent. He leaned close, close enough that only she could hear him. "You just made a mistake." His whisper carried the weight of a threat executed with surgical precision. Natalie finished gathering the papers without responding. She stood, balanced the scattered files against her chest, and walked toward the trash can with the same measured pace she'd used to cross hostile compounds 15 years ago. Muscle memory. The room stayed silent until she'd cleared the swinging doors. Then conversations resumed, but they were different now, hushed, speculative, the way people talk after witnessing something they don't fully understand. That evening, Natalie sat in her small apartment on Maple Street in northeast Denver, her laptop open to the cardiac unit's billing database. The screen reflected in her eyes like the glow of distant fire. She'd noticed the discrepancies weeks ago: phantom procedures coded to Medicare, inflated equipment charges for devices never implanted, a pattern so clean it looked choreographed. 3 phantom pericardiocentesis procedures in 1 month. Each one reimbursed at $47,000. Each one dated to days when the patient census was low, when charts might slip through without scrutiny. Her hands moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd filed incident reports in combat zones, who understood how to document the undocumentable. She photographed 3 pages with her phone camera. The flash made her wince. Sterling watched from his office window as she left through the parking lot at 7:13 p.m. He'd been waiting for this, some small mistake, some thread of vulnerability he could pull. Not the billing fraud. That wasn't her. A nurse didn't care about administration enough to threaten it. But he'd seen her expression when she said it, that voice like a tank idling in a garage, and he understood what she was. She was dangerous. Worse than dangerous, she was honest, which meant she was predictable, which meant she could be eliminated. He pulled up his contacts list on his desk phone. Board Chairman Hendricks answered on the 4th ring, the man's irritation audible in the space between syllables. Sterling pitched his voice lower, confidential. We have a problem with a new cardiac nurse. Credential concerns. Erratic behavior during patient interactions. I need you to trust me on this one, I've been doing this longer than anyone in that department. Hendricks agreed to an expedited review. 1 phone call. That's all it took to set the mechanism in motion. The next morning, Sterling contacted each of Natalie's 3 references, a supervisor from her last hospital, a physician she'd worked with, a nurse manager from her previous facility. His messages were perfectly calibrated. Not accusations. Questions. Routine verification regarding her employment history and any behavioral concerns you might have documented. The tone was professional, official, the kind of inquiry that nobody wants to answer except through the filter of institutional protection. All 3 called back within hours, each one carefully non-committal but each one admitting that yes, there had been some concerns, nothing serious, just some questions about her reliability. Her demeanor. Whether she'd fit well in a traditional hierarchy. Sterling filed a formal complaint with HR by noon. He attached written statements from 2 residents he'd mentored, young physicians he'd taken under his wing with promises of recommendation letters and research opportunities. They'd signed anything he put in front of them. The statements described Natalie as insubordinate, emotionally unstable, potentially impaired during critical patient care. The words were carefully chosen, vague enough to be deniable but specific enough to raise flags. By 2:08 p.m., he'd emailed the hospital's credential verification service, flagging her file for urgent authentication review of alleged military background claims. He was methodical. He was competent. He was not a man who got cornered by nurses folding linens. That same afternoon, an elderly patient named James Kershaw checked into the cardiac observation unit. His chart listed him as retired Navy, 74 years old, presenting with chest pain and pericardial effusion. He wore a Naval Academy class ring, faded gold on a weathered hand. When Natalie took his vitals, blood pressure 142/88, heart rate 76, oxygen saturation 94% on room air, she noted that his eyes followed her with strange intensity. He studied her face like he was reading text written in a language nobody else could translate. What's your name, nurse? His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to having his questions answered. Natalie Hayes, she said, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm with practiced efficiency. He closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. For a moment he didn't speak, didn't breathe, didn't move. Then, 20 years, he whispered. I've been looking for 20 years. Natalie didn't respond. She recorded his vitals on the chart and left the room, but something had shifted in her posture, some small fracture in the wall she'd built. She didn't know why a Navy admiral's words had landed like shrapnel. That night, Natalie sat in her kitchen in the dark, hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug. Her 16-year-old son Marcus found her there when he came home from his shift at the grocery store. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, the kind of place where someone came to disappear. Mom. His voice cracked slightly, the way teenage boys' voices do. Why are you crying? She hadn't realized she was. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so quick it almost negated the tears. Hard day, she said. Nothing you need to worry about. He didn't believe her. He was old enough to recognize a lie shaped like parental protection. He sat across from her and didn't push, which was the cruelest kindness a child could offer. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." Her hands were shaking. She tucked them under the table where he couldn't see them. This was the thing about military training, it taught you to compartmentalize everything except your body's betrayal. Your hands knew what your mind was trying to deny. Sterling walked through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial at 11:36 p.m., his footsteps echoing on linoleum. The hospital was different at night. The fluorescent light seemed harsher, the shadows deeper, the air thinner. He passed Natalie's locker without looking at it. Inside, he knew, was a photograph of a man in navy dress whites, a teenager in a soccer uniform, a life that had nothing to do with this moment. He'd already confirmed that detail through HR: single mother, widow, military spouse's benefits. All the vulnerabilities he needed. By midnight, his administrative apparatus was fully activated. The credential verification service would take 7 to 10 business days, but that was fine. Hendricks had already suggested an administrative leave pending the outcome. Sterling had suggested they wait for the formal review, appearing magnanimous, the voice of caution. He was painting her as mentally unstable, professionally questionable, possibly dangerous. By the time the verification came back clean, and it would come back clean, because her record was immaculate, it wouldn't matter. The question would linger. The doubt would remain. The damage would be done. He passed the cardiac unit and noticed her station empty. On the desk was a single chart, perfectly organized, notes written in precise handwriting. Everything in its place. Everything documented with the meticulousness of someone trained to keep records under fire. He opened it and closed it without reading it. He didn't need to. He already knew what she was capable of. What he didn't know was that the walls he was building around her were about to have a breach he couldn't see coming. What he didn't know was that the elderly Admiral in room 407 had spent 2 decades searching for a ghost, and the ghost had just walked past his door. What he didn't know was that in 72 hours, every mechanism he'd set in motion would become irrelevant because the entire structure of his power was about to collapse under the weight of something far larger than institutional politics. But Sterling slept well that night. He had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The monitor's first scream came at 6:22 a.m., 2 days after the cafeteria, when Admiral James Kershaw's heart began drowning in its own fluid. Natalie was changing an 4 bag on the 3rd floor when the rapid beep penetrated the wall, that particular rhythm that meant something had shifted from stable to catastrophic. Not the slow decline of a body giving up. The sharp panic of a system in collapse. She set down the saline, already moving toward the sound before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory older than her civilian nursing license pulling her forward like a current. The cardiac unit bustled with the controlled chaos of morning rounds, residents clustered around charts, the attending surgeon from the night shift still dictating notes, fluorescent lights humming their antiseptic hymn. But the energy changed the moment she entered Kershaw's room. The monitor was screaming. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 82% and was still falling. His jugular veins were distended like cords beneath his weathered skin, visibly pulsing with pressure that should not have existed. A resident stood frozen beside the bed, hands hovering uselessly. He was stable, the young doctor stammered. Vitals were normal. Then his pressure just. Cardiac tamponade, Natalie said, not a question, moving to Kershaw's side. She could see it immediately, the muffled heart sounds, the pattern of deterioration that meant fluid was filling the pericardial sac, compressing his heart like a fist slowly closing around living tissue. The Admiral's face had taken on a greyish pallor, lips beginning their transition toward blue. His breathing shallow. Panicked. Dr. Sterling arrived within seconds, that predatory stride that made residents straighten like iron filings to a magnet. He took one look at the monitor, the vital signs cascading downward, and his eyes narrowed with something that resembled satisfaction. A code. A chance to demonstrate superiority. Someone call cardiothoracic, he commanded. Full surgical team. Now. 20 minutes out, a resident reported, phone already pressed to her ear. They're finishing a valve replacement in OR3. 20 minutes, Sterling repeated, and the words landed like a sentence. He turned to Natalie with the kind of stare that had spent 2 days practicing its indifference. "Stand down, nurse. This requires a surgeon." The Admiral's pressure dropped to 68 systolic. His lips had gone the color of old plums. The monitor's beeping accelerated into that ascending wail that meant the heart itself was failing, that a body on the precipice could fall sideways at any moment. Natalie had been 17 when she performed her first emergency thoracotomy under fire at FOB Shank, had cracked open a Marine's chest cavity with a scalpel and her hands because the alternative was watching him die. Had done it again in Fallujah. 3 times in Tikrit, once at a checkpoint where the mortar fire was so close the concussion knocked her sideways even as blood pooled beneath her palms. Muscle memory wasn't muscle memory at all. It was survival burned so deeply into the nervous system that it transcended choice. She stepped sideways around Sterling's frame like water flowing around a stone and reached for the emergency crash cart without hesitation. Her hands knew exactly which drawer held the thoracic needle kit, knew the weight of a 14-gauge angiocath, the angle of approach, the specific geography of a human ribcage when the clock was counting down to death. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sterling's voice rose to something approaching a shout, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. One of the residents, a young man with the kind of courage that only came from witnessing the impossible, stepped between them. "Sir, look," he said quietly, and something in his tone was enough. Sterling's hand fell away. Natalie's breathing had dropped to something almost meditative. The room's chaos became background noise, a distant hum beneath the focused clarity of someone operating in extremis. She positioned the Admiral's left side toward her, located the landmarks beneath his ribs, the xiphoid process below, the left shoulder above, and found the angle with the precision of someone who had done this while explosions rattled the windows. 45 degrees. Slow. Advancing by millimeters, feeling for the resistance of the pericardial sac giving way beneath the needle's tip. The syringe was already attached, already drawing back gently, and then the syringe filled with dark blood. 50 milliliters. 60. The kind of fluid that meant a life had been draining internally, the pericardium filling with pressure that crushed the heart's own ability to beat. The Admiral gasped, a sound like a man surfacing from drowning, and his oxygen saturation climbed. 78, 82. 86, the monitor's frantic beeping slowed, descending from crisis into something resembling normalcy. His color returned not gradually but in a rush, as if someone had flipped a switch inside his chest. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he was simply a man returning to the world, confused by the distance he'd traveled. Then his gaze found Natalie's face. What crossed his expression was not gratitude. It was something far more profound, a kind of recognition that seemed to rewrite the room's geometry, to make all the standard walls and monitors irrelevant. His trembling hand reached up and gripped her wrist with surprising strength for a man who had been dying 30 seconds earlier. His eyes, grey as Atlantic weather, locked onto hers with an intensity that made the monitors seem to pause. "The boots," he whispered, his voice thick with something that could have been tears or wonder or both. "You still have the boots I sent." The fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder. Natalie's hand went cold despite the warmth of his grip. Behind her, Sterling's jaw tightened as he watched her face drain of color, watched her step backward with the careful precision of someone trying not to fall. He was already calculating, his eyes moving between the Admiral and Natalie with the speed of someone seeing the edges of his carefully constructed world beginning to fray. Natalie opened her mouth. Closed it. The Admiral's fingers were still trembling, his eyes still fixed on her face with the intensity of someone looking at a ghost that had somehow become flesh. In those eyes was 20 years of searching, of carrying something forward through a military career, of preserving a memory so carefully that it had survived intact until this moment, this room, this impossible convergence. She had saved a 6-year-old boy in Tikrit. Had found him bleeding from shrapnel wounds in a compound during a routine patrol, had clamped vessels and improvised bandages while mortars screamed overhead, and her hands, these hands, had shook but did not fail. She had never learned his name. Had never known if he survived beyond that day. Had learned long ago not to ask. But he had survived. He had more than survived. He had become Admiral James Kershaw, and his hands remembered hers. But Sterling was already on his phone before the surgical resident finished his first assessment. He stood in the hallway outside the cardiac unit, voice low and measured, the kind of tone that had bought him a lake house and kept 3 board members indebted to favors they'd never publicly acknowledge. "Chairman Hendricks," he said, walking circles on the tile. "We have a situation. Credential irregularity. Potential negligence." He paused, listening. The new nurse, Hayes, she performed an invasive thoracic procedure without attending physician authorization. Pericardiocentesis. On an active patient. No training documentation on file. Another pause. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been wrong, or at least had never faced consequences for being wrong. "I want the medical board investigation initiated within the hour. Before she contaminates any other records." 20 minutes later, 3 hospital investigators arrived with laminated badges and the kind of institutional authority that made even competent staff members second-guess themselves. They found Natalie in the break room, still wearing gloves dusted with the Admiral's blood, her jaw set and her hands steady despite the fluorescent lights that seemed to buzz louder when she was alone. The lead investigator, a woman with grey streaks and a folder that had materialized from nowhere, gestured toward the conference room. "Senior Chief? We need to ask you some questions about the Kershaw intervention." Natalie followed without speaking. They sat across from her, 3 against 1, the kind of odds that would have meant nothing if this had been a combat scenario and everything in this sterile room with its water-stained ceiling tiles. "Your credentials on file," the woman began, tapping a form, "indicate RN licensure with a specialization in cardiac nursing." "Correct." Natalie nodded once. "There is no mention of thoracic procedures, emergency interventions, or trauma response training beyond standard hospital protocol." The investigator leaned forward. "The needle decompression technique you use today, that's not in any nurse practitioner manual. Where did you receive that training?" Silence. Natalie's hands remained on the table, palms down, fingers extended. She did not flinch. She did not explain. She did not defend. "We have 3 witness statements," the second investigator continued, indicating you acted independently. The attending physician was not consulted before needle insertion. There was no authorization chain documented. He placed photographs on the table, screenshots of her personnel file, her initial application, her background check. Everything spotless. Everything anonymous. Everything designed to keep her invisible. "These things concern us, Senior Chief. They concern the hospital. And frankly, they concern us about the character judgment of whoever hired you." Still nothing. She had survived interrogations by people who understood that information was the most valuable commodity on the planet. These 3 understood only paperwork. The third investigator, a younger man with the kind of confidence that came from having never lost, produced a second folder. Sterling's work. Fabricated behavioral reports dating back weeks, incidents that never happened, concerning patterns that existed only in his imagination, a narrative of erratic conduct and suspicious competence. Natalie recognized the handwriting on one of the summaries. Sterling's own pen, creating evidence the way he created everything else, with calculated precision and the understanding that most people would believe what was written down, regardless of truth. "Dr. Sterling has documented several episodes of concerning behavior," the investigator explained, reading word by word. "Isolation from staff. Failure to follow chain of command. Aggressive corrective interventions with other medical personnel. And now this, an unauthorized procedure that could have constituted assault." He looked at her directly. "Can you explain any of this?" Natalie did not blink. Did not move. Composure was a weapon, and she had spent 20 years learning how to wield it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. By 3 p.m., the decision was already made. The investigation was a formality, a box to check before executing what Sterling had orchestrated before the Admiral had even opened his eyes. Security escorted her to the locker room at the change of shift, when enough staff would be around to witness it but not enough to interfere. The same guard who had smiled at her that morning, a man named Torres with a young daughter he'd mentioned once while standing near the medication dispensary, would not meet her eyes now. He handed her a cardboard box. The same kind used to pack donated supplies, brown and worn and utterly devoid of dignity. "I'm sorry," Torres said, his voice like gravel. "Orders." "Your badge, please." Natalie removed her hospital ID and set it on the box. The photograph was 3 months old, a face trying so hard to be ordinary that it barely qualified as human. She opened her locker. Scrubs in 2 shades of blue, folded the way she'd learned to fold them in basic training. A photograph of her late husband in his dress whites, taken on their wedding day at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Her phone charger. A bottle of ibuprofen. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag so faded it was almost translucent, the pair of worn combat boots she had carried for 20 years. She lifted them from the locker, felt the weight of Tikrit dust still embedded in the seams, the weight of all those stitches that had held them together through 2 decades of trying not to be found. The rubber sole on the left boot was separating slightly from the leather. The heel was scuffed. They were falling apart, held together by stubbornness and the understanding that some things should never be new. She set them in the cardboard box, tucked them under her arm along with the photograph of David. "When?" she asked Torres. "Effective immediately. Your final check will be mailed." He looked away. "I'm really sorry." Natalie walked past the cardiac unit without looking through the windows, past the main desk where 3 nurses she had worked with for months glanced at the box and then quickly away, past the cafeteria where she had cleaned floors and folded linens and made herself so small that even her own competence had failed to announce her. The automatic doors opened before she reached them, as if the hospital itself was eager to expel her. Rain hammered down in Denver's way, aggressive and cold, the kind of rain that belonged in a movie about failure and consequences. She drove to Riverside Cemetery on the south side of the city, the same route she took every 3 months, the same parking spot she always chose, the same arrangement of flowers she always brought. The rain made the grass slick. Her boots, the new boots, the regulation civilian ones that had never held Tikrit dust, slipped in the mud. The headstone read simply, "David Michael Hayes, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, beloved husband, 1979 to 2019. No religious symbols. No poetry. Just facts, the way David had preferred facts. Natalie knelt in the mud. The wet earth soaked through her scrub pants. The rain ran down her neck. And for the first time in 11 years, since the day she had received the notification that David had died of complications from a blood infection contracted during a routine surgery at a base hospital in Virginia, she let the mask drop completely. "I tried," she whispered, and her voice broke like something fragile hitting concrete. "I tried to disappear. Tried to be normal, tried to heal, and I failed you again." Her hand shook as she held the photograph from her locker. "I can't keep running, but I can't keep fighting. Where do I go now?" The rain answered only with its rhythm, that mechanical persistence of weather that understood nothing of loss. She knelt there until dark, until her legs began to numb from the cold ground, until even her military training couldn't override the simple physics of a human body in trauma. When she finally stood, her knees buckled once, just once, before the muscle memory took over and steadied her. She drove home to the apartment that had never felt like home, the one bedroom in a building filled with people who never asked questions and never expected answers. Marcus wasn't there. Just a note on the kitchen counter, his handwriting angular and urgent. "Mom, went to find something. Back soon. M." She started pulling boxes from the storage closet, started packing methodically, the way she had done 3 years ago when she left the Navy, the way she had learned to pack for quick exits and tactical relocations. Uniforms into one box, though she still owned no uniforms. Personal items into another. The wrapped combat boots went carefully between books, cradled like the artifact they had become. She was halfway through her bedroom closet when the front door burst open and Marcus stood in the doorway, breathless and alive with purpose in a way that reminded her exactly why 16-year-olds should not have access to the internet. He was carrying a show box. The FBI agent moved to Sterling's side before Commander Wells finished speaking, his hand settling on the doctor's shoulder with the weight of a gavel. "Dr. Sterling," the agent said, voice flat as courthouse marble, "we've been investigating your billing practices for 6 months. Phantom procedures coded to Medicare. Inflated equipment charges. Kickbacks from medical supply companies totaling $17 million over 4 years." The words hung in the conference room air like surgical smoke that wouldn't clear. Sterling's face went the color of old bone. Those are fabrications. She's poisoned this investigation with, the agent's grip tightened. "You're under arrest." The room exhaled as one. Chairman Hendricks stood, his tailored suit suddenly looking like borrowed clothes. "I'm resigning from this board effective immediately, pending investigation into my role in approving those contracts." 2 residents who'd laughed hardest at Natalie in the hallways found the exit simultaneously, their laughter dead as flatlined monitors. Sterling's voice rose, trembling now, the careful architecture of his confidence collapsing like a hospital ceiling. "She performed an unauthorized procedure, violated every protocol in the manual." Commander Wells turned toward him, and when she moved, the air itself seemed to sharpen. Her eyes carried the specific coldness of someone who'd seen what real protocol violations cost in blood. Senior Chief Hayes performed a field pericardiocentesis under combat circumstances using skills honed in Tikrit, where she kept 17 people alive including an Admiral of the United States Navy. Wells paused, let that sink like a stone through dark water. "The only violation in this room is yours, Doctor." Hospital security moved in then, the same guard who'd handed Natalie her termination box 3 days earlier, cardboard still creasing his palms. He carried an identical box now, held it out to Sterling like a mirror. His voice was flat, final, the kind of calm that comes from watching consequences arrive on schedule. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Sterling's hands trembled as he took the box. His face crumbled like old plaster, and he walked out through the same hallway where he'd strutted past Natalie's bowed head, past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her lunch tray from her hands in front of the entire staff. Press cameras flashed, the kind of strobe that marks the end of one life and the beginning of another. Natalie stood motionless through all of it, her breathing steady as a metronome, her composure the only currency that mattered now. Admiral Kershaw moved toward her slowly, his surgeon's warning still fresh in his chest. He lowered himself onto both knees despite the foot still taped to his wrist, his ancient frame bending with deliberate reverence. "You saved me twice," he said, his voice breaking like ice in spring water. "Once when I was too young to understand the gift, and again when I was old enough to know what gratitude truly means." Natalie's jaw unclenched, the first visible crack in her armor since this had all begun. Marcus was beside her suddenly, his 16-year-old frame tall enough now that his hand reached her shoulder, and his eyes held something that looked like seeing his mother for the first time. Natalie helped Admiral Kershaw to his feet, their hands meeting like recognition itself, and she let herself be embraced. The room watched a woman who'd been invisible become impossible to look away from. The composure didn't shatter, it transformed. Her shoulders straightened. Her voice, when she finally spoke to Kershaw, carried the authority of someone who'd held lives together in the dark. "Welcome home, Admiral." 6 months carried its own weight. Natalie stood in her new office, created specifically for her, the hospital's first director of emergency medicine, and fastened her senior chief anchors onto the collar of her white coat. The rank she'd carried silently was now visible, stitched into uniform whites that matched her credentials at last. Her office overlooked the cardiac unit where she'd once folded linens in the supply closet, invisible as dust. On her desk sat a pair of worn combat boots, child-sized, still bearing the pale dust of Tikrit soil that never quite washes away. Admiral Kershaw had kept them for 20 years, had tracked her through military records after his rescue, learned she was the medic who'd saved him, and sent them to her when he graduated the Naval Academy with a note in his own hand, "For the angel who gave me a future." Marcus appeared in her doorway dressed in navy recruit whites, the kind of dress uniform that looks both too big and exactly right on 17-year-olds. He was leaving for basic training in 2 weeks. "You never told me," he said quietly. Natalie turned from the window, the boots still in her hands. "I needed to forget before I could remember," she answered. A local news report played on the small television in the corner. Dr. Sterling at a community college, teaching CPR fundamentals to teenagers who scrolled on their phones while he demonstrated chest compressions on a rubber dummy. His hands moved through the motions mechanically, like muscle memory of a life that no longer belonged to him. The reporter's voice was matter-of-fact. "His medical license has been permanently revoked. Federal charges carry a potential sentence of up to 20 years. Natalie turned the television off. Through her window, she watched a new nurse, young, uncertain, nearly invisible, organizing supplies in the cardiac unit below. The nurse moved carefully, aware she was being observed, the specific discomfort of someone who felt small in a large institution. Natalie made a note to introduce herself tomorrow morning, to make sure this one felt seen. The hospital's main wall bore a new plaque now, Hayes Emergency Medicine Center, dedicated to those who serve twice. Natalie stood at her desk, one small boot in her hands, Marcus's arm around her shoulders, both of them finally whole. The rain that had fallen on her husband's grave 3 days ago seemed very far away now, like it belonged to someone else's story. She thought of Sterling walking out through those same doors, carrying his cardboard box like a prop from a play about consequences. She thought of Admiral Kershaw kneeling before her, a man she'd saved as a child, saved again as an old man, connected by 2 moments of competence separated by 20 years and an entire life she'd thought she'd left behind. The boot smelled like desert sand and memory and the specific perfume of gratitude that can't be purchased. In the hallway, the new nurse walked past, clipboard in hand, and Natalie caught her eye. The nurse hesitated, then smiled. Natalie smiled back. Some patterns don't repeat, they heal. Some stories don't end where they begin. Some heroes walk among us pushing equipment through hospital corridors, saving lives in the dark, waiting for the moment when the world finally recognizes what the quiet ones have known all along. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If this story resonated with you, please hit subscribe and leave a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you have done in Natalie's position?